So here we are at Cooper Union, and the president spoke here today. As he did so, it must have been hard not to feel befuddled if you were the ghosts who occupy this hall. This is a place of great union history where rallies were held and strikes were announced as President Obama continues his straddle to balance both his support on Wall Street and his commitments to the working people of this country. How's he doing? Wall Street's up. The Dow Jones is up, but so are foreclosures. We'll talk about it today. So we're here at Cooper Union with Sarah Ludwig, who's co-director of NEDAP. It's a neighborhood community development organization for housing justice, among other things. Sarah, you were just inside listening to what Barack Obama had to say here today. What were the high points for you?
I mean, I think the high points were he was really just calling out Wall Street and saying to the people in the room, any of you who are here from Wall Street, I'm really giving a message to you, which is that all the reforms that we're pushing for are really basic, reasonable reforms, and that you've been sending, and you use the word, battalions of lobbyists to DC, spending millions of dollars, each company, to defeat really basic reforms, and that if we don't get these passed, we're really doomed to repeat the crisis that we have now, and that it's a sort of, we're in a horrible, untenable situation with the breakdown over this financial reform.
Well, let's talk about it. I mean, one of the other aspects of his speech was that he came here 2 years ago on his campaign calling for some of these kinds of things. To what extent is he right when he says, sort of, in effect, if you'd given me then what I'm asking for now, we wouldn't be where we are today? Is it true?
Well, I mean, you know, a lot of the industry and some of the Republican rhetoric is that he's anti-Wall Street and that these reforms are anti-Wall Street. And actually, he and the reforms are very pro-Wall Street. He's very clear about that. You know, I believe in the free market. I think we just can't have an unfettered market, and that the problems that we have, we need to have some monitoring. So the reforms that he's proposed and that he proposed before, you know, they're good, but they're sort of, you know, the minimum of what we need, and they certainly don't take the structural approach that we need. There was a lot of focus in his speech right now on too big to fail. That's what he started talking about, and how we need to have basic reforms where it's not taxpayers who foot the bill from these gigantic companies, but didn't really get into sort of a broader issue of what does it mean that we have these massive financial institutions that wield the economic and political power that they wield. So it's just kind of, you know, we need to regulate this. He talked also about how we need a consumer financial protection agency. Again, what his administration has proposed, it's good. It doesn't go nearly far enough. But the industry is fighting tooth and nail to defeat even these sort of modest regulatory changes that he's proposed.
Well, one of the initiatives of the administration a year ago that was referred to here, of course, was TARP, the passage of TARP and the bailout of the banks. One of the big front page stories this day, as we're talking on USA Today front page, is that the very banks that received the money from TARP are the ones who have reduced, not increased, but reduced their lending most. That's part of what's fueling people like those who gathered here today. There weren't hordes, but there was some, mostly from the Tea Party movement, saying this just shows that government's ineffective. What we need is not more government action, but less government in our lives.
I mean, there's no question that there's a big accountability issue around TARP. And the research that's in the paper today is borne out by groups around the country who've been seeing that the very banks that benefited from the public bailout have reduced their lending proportionate to other lenders out there. So there's a really fundamental accountability issue with TARP. But that's not to say that the government doesn't have a role to play. And so there was lots of talk about whose responsibility it is to have a bailout. There's also a lot of discussion about derivatives, which are these shadow financial products. And I thought that he said some good things that need to be said because it's a complicated subject that most people don't even want to hear about. But what he said was for every dollar that's traded on the shadow financial market, you've got a family involved. You've got an auto loan, a home loan. You've got all these things that are being traded on the actual loans that are being made, and that we need to bring it down to earth and think about communities and families. So rhetorically, that's good. That doesn't mean that the reforms that are out there are looking that way, but it's a slightly different rhetorical tack to sort of be clear that this is about people, this is about communities, and actually said to the financial institutions in the room, stop fighting, get on board for what that's worth.
Well, some people are working. We can hear them in the background.
Yeah.
One last question. While we're here at Cooper Union, one is so strongly reminded of worker history. Right? This is a place where from the 1860s on, union leaders would come and rally their forces. You had in 1909 the declaration of one of the biggest New York City strikes took place right here. And as I'm thinking about that history and the shirtwaist workers going out on strike, 30,000 of them against the bosses, I'm reminded of how Obama is doing an interesting kind of straddle today, and how 2 years ago on the campaign, he not only gave a speech here calling for reform, but also went to meet with Wall Street bankers and others to gather contributions for his campaign. Can you, to be very crude about it, serve both these masters of we the people and them the bankers when this is the issue, government's relationship to regulation of those banks?
Yeah, I think that's fundamentally a conflict, and you can't be raising money from them and being, parlaying favor with them and then meaningfully change the system. And that, I think, has been kind of the stymieing factor all along.
And finally, were you disappointed that most of the demonstrators here, and again, there weren't that many, but who was here, were mostly from what's broadly defined as the right, nobody else?
Well, they didn't really have a huge presence here, in my view. And I mean, they were here, but, people haven't organized around this in the way that we need to in general.
Are you hopeful we'll get financial reform, at least as a start?
I think there's going to be some elements that pass. I think that the problems are so much bigger than what's been proposed. But yeah, they're going to put some stuff through because now the Republicans are feeling like they're going to be shamed if they don't back something.
Sarah Ludwig from NEDAP. There's a link to the organization at our website.